noteworthy because it's a cool season vegetable production area for basically the country during the summer months. And the reason I brought you to this spot here is we have a trial going on here in this cover crop field, and I'll explain why we're doing this trial, but it's kind of a long explanation, so it's a roundabout explanation. But you know, I don't know, have you all seen the movie East of Eden, or read the book, you know, about James Dean, you know, freaking out and having a fit about various things? But what was going on in that family, they were raising lettuce in the Salinas Valley. And it was the beginning days of growing iceberg lettuce. Back they called it iceberg lettuce, head lettuce, and then shipping it by train to New York. And we're still doing that to this day. And that's a whole, that kind of sums up the whole Salinas Valley in a sentence. We're producing the cool season vegetables because the rest of the country during the summer is too warm. There's little pockets here and there where they can do some of that. But basically we have a whole valley, and that's what we do here. And so we supply like 90% of the lettuce during the summer months. We're at the turn now. The lettuce is just about done here in the valley. You might still see a few fields, maybe on the Callahan Ranch where you might have seen some lettuce, but they're basically finishing up, and then everything goes to the desert. It goes to Yuma in the Imperial Valley. And but in those 100 years since you know, East of Eden, we've been growing these more and more intensely, these vegetable rotations. And so now what we have is a whole valley. That's what we do here. You know, it wasn't that long ago when I first started, we still had sugar beets here. And actually, if you look at the seal of some of these cities, like the city of Watsonville, they have a sugar beet and a shard of wheat. So that's what we used to grow. You know, we used to grow agronomic crops here. So King City in the south was known for pink beans, these King City pinks, they used to call them. So, you know, but all of those crops have basically been replaced now. There's not one sugar beet grown in this valley anymore. Little bit of dry farm barley, you know, in the south on some cheaper rents and so forth. So, so that's been an economic boon. You know, if you look at the value of ag in just Monterey County alone, not counting Santa Cruz and San Benito, it's $4.3 billion. Lettuce alone is about $1.2 billion. I mean, that's a lot of value to these crops. You know, and as I mentioned, you know, very little of it is eaten here. It's shipped to distant markets, right? You know, if you go to Cleveland and you go to the store in August and you look at the lettuce, it's undoubtedly from Salinas or Santa Maria, another little valley down the coast. So, but what has resulted as a result of that, because it's a high value crop, there's high stakes. You know, if you really want to see, you know, kind of what's at stake, you can, you know, go to the cost and return studies. I don't know if you guys have talked about those things, but read the lettuce cost and return studies. You can see what does it cost to grow a crop of lettuce. And now, of course, those costs have gone up because of this year we have, you know, the gas prices are higher, you know, shipping, getting supplies, all these things. It's been a very difficult and very expensive year for agricultural production. But because of that high value, they don't take any risks for you know, crop loss. And so what they'll tend to do is, and this was the pattern, you know, starting back in the 1920s, is you know, putting on enough fertilizer. Well, let's put on just a little bit more just to make sure that's not an issue. And if you look at those cost and return studies and you look at what is the cost of the crop and the cost of that fertilizer, the cost of that fertilizer is a very small percent. So there was zero incentive to scrimp on fertilizer. But in the Salinas Valley, we don't import any water. All the water that we have here is groundwater. We do have a system where we have 2 reservoirs in the south, and we can meter water out of those reservoirs. They come up the Salinas River. Salinas River is right there, and then it recharges the groundwater as it goes. And so all the cities, Soledad, Greenfield, Salinas, all of them get their drinking water from the groundwater. So then you put 2 and 2 together. One of the big issues that we have is nitrate leaching. And the biggest source of that is the agricultural production. And so there's been pressure put on the growers for like the last 20 years to improve efficiency of fertilizer use. And however, it was all a conditional, what we called a conditional waiver by the Regional Water Quality Control Board. And so we did educational efforts, and we did a lot of talking about what to do. But we also had an effort by the University of California, spearheaded by Tim Hartz, who was a specialist who's retired now, and then Mike Kahn, who you just met, and myself. We worked as a team to develop practices to help growers be more efficient with their use of fertilizer. And one key practice was the use of just simply testing for nitrate when you come to the first side dress, the first fertilizer application. Test your soil and see what kind of residual levels of nitrate are sitting there. And so like this field that's right behind us right now, that was broccoli, and they just dissed it a week or 2 ago. And one of the things about broccoli, you know, this is part of this, all these various studies that we did. We did so many different evaluations, but we looked specifically at broccoli, and one of the things we found was that broccoli contains, an average broccoli crop, that one we were talking about over there, you know, has about 250 to 350 pounds of nitrogen in the biomass. How much do they take away in the boxes when they harvest the broccoli? About 90 pounds. So you can see that they're leaving a lot of residual nitrogen in the soil. So that soil, if you were to test it right now, because we had a little bit of rain, but not enough to leach anything, you know, the numbers in that soil could be 30 or 40 parts per million nitrate nitrogen. And so, but it's going to sit there fallow over the winter. And so we have a storm coming here later this weekend or early next week. And if we start getting enough rain that can leach some, start to move that nitrate, because as you know, nitrate is not going to, it's not bound to anything in the soil. It just moves. It actually lives in the soil pores, you know, because there's all these negative charges in the soil. It has no place to go. So it lives in the pores, and then the rain just pushes it down. So this is the problem. Is we have this inefficiency, and that's inefficiency just during the winter. This nitrate testing that I was talking about, that's a practice for during the growing season, and to help growers to be more efficient about the application of nitrogen that they put on. So, so in April 2021, Ag Order 4.0 got approved by the Regional Water Quality Control Board. That is not a conditional waiver anymore. That is an ag order. That means it's got regulations. That means it's got teeth. And so what they did, they said, okay, the amount of loading, and when I say loading, that means, you know, how much nitrogen you put on, that's one part of it. Removal is the other part. So applied A minus R, removal, is your loading. So they set the first levels at 500 pounds per acre per year. That's not a problem. Everybody can meet that stipulation. But it's going to ratchet down. And in the next 5 years, it's going to get down to around 300 pounds of loading. And that number starts to be a problem for these growers. And Mike Kahn and I, we've done different scenarios, kind of looking at how much nitrogen do people put on, how much nitrogen is typically leaving the field, and so forth. And so once we get down to around 300 pounds, that's going to be an issue for a lot of growers. The numbers don't stop at 300 pounds. They're going to keep going to 200, then to 100, and then eventually to 50. But that's in the future. That's farther down the line. We're very concerned about this current situation in the next 5 years. Is what we're going to try and get through. And well, it turns out one of the things, and this is to the credit of the Water Board, Mike Kahn and I, we spent a lot of time before Ag Order was passed. We spent a lot of time. We met with every single one of those board members on the regional board. We met with some of the staff, and we helped them. And I don't know if Mike talked about any of this, but Mike had a real pivotal, had some real pivotal input in that. They were also going to put how much nitrogen is in the water, again, on that A side of the equation. And so we worked with them and Mike ended up helping them to figure out that we just need to account for the water that the crop takes up, so the ET of the crop. So a crop like lettuce might use 7 or 8 inches, but you might put 15 inches on to water the crop. So we don't count the whole 15, we just count those 7 inches. And that's important. That was an important thing for the growers, and it was also just the science of the situation. And then one of the things that we were able to also get them to do was to include cover crops on the R side of the equation. And the beauty of that is that a cover crop like this, it can take up 150 pounds of nitrogen, and the grower can get a credit. You can put that on the R side of the equation. And I think that makes a lot of sense, because the problem with this business, people have the impression, the growers don't care and they're just doing this and that. But that's not entirely true. A grower can do the best that he or she can, but the problem is there's always inefficiency. And one of the things that a cover crop does is that it absolves all those problems. It captures this. I mean, look how green this is. I don't know what the prior crop was. I think it was probably lettuce. But there's a lot of residual nitrogen. I mean, you could grow a whole grain crop off of what's left here. So one of the things that's happened is that the growers who are paying attention, who are looking at this ag order and getting proactive and trying to figure out, okay, here come these regulations, what can we do? Let's get out ahead of this problem and start to address it. This grower did that, and you can see this is a huge, this is 4 blocks on this particular ranch, and they had cover crop on every single block. Now they can't put cover crop on every block. It doesn't, scheduling and so forth doesn't work out. But they're trying to understand how can they start to fit cover crops into their rotations, what works for them. Okay? Now, the thing that the ag order did is if this is the world of cover crops, is this big, what they did is they said, okay, this is a cover crop. It's overwintered, it's planted October, you knock it down in like February, March. It's got to have, 4,000 pounds of biomass. It's got to have a C to N ratio of 20 to 1. They had these different stipulations that they put on it. That's great, but that narrow slice of the cover crop world doesn't fit the reality out here. This cover crop is not going to get any credit it does. They're going to knock it down by Thanksgiving. That's their, that's the approach that they're using here. It's a fall planted cover crop. They're planted October, September, knocked down, August, September, knocked down October, November. They want to get this cover crop in, but they don't want to have it in the spring. Because what happens if you have a wet spring and you have a cover crop out here? See, then it's a problem, because the issue here is that everything is scheduled, to produce all that lettuce for, all these places, everything has to be scheduled very, very precisely. And if you have a cover crop there and you have like all this rain that's happening, let's say we have a wet spring, and you have that cover crop sitting there, then all of a sudden it's a problem, and it's a really big problem, because then also you have to work the soil in the spring when it's wet, and that's a problem, working wet soil with this heavy equipment they use. So their concept is to grow these fall slot cover crops and get them in, get them knocked down. Of course we could have a wet fall too, but they're willing to work with that more so than those wet spring conditions. And so then that is where we get involved, is because, all right, a grower should get a credit for this cover crop, some kind of a credit. So what makes sense? What scientifically can we do to try and get some kind of a credit for this cover crop? Is it a valid thing to ask? So what we're doing here, we've been monitoring these fall cover crops, and so we have a sense of, typically what they're doing is they're growing them for 50 to 60 days in the fall. And then they knock them down and get them all prepared just like that. They in those what we call winter beds or peaked beds, and then they go through the winter. Well, what starts to happen to this residue? What happens to it? Starts to break down, right? Starts to mineralize. It because this what's the form of nitrogen in this biomass? It's probably some proteins and chlorophyll and other things, and so that begins to break down, because really our soil temperatures here in the winter are still warm enough for mineralization to occur. And we've seen this. You watch nitrate levels over the winter, they keep going up. Why? Because we have mineralization that continues, and soil organic matter. Here you have this fresh soil organic matter, and what we've seen in studies we did last year, the carbon nitrogen ratio gets to about 16, 17 in that 50 to 60 days. So that's still pretty favorable for mineralization to occur. So then what our current idea is now is to we're going to work with Daniel Geisler. How much time do I have?
A few minutes. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm almost getting there. There is one more thing I wanted to mention, but with Daniel Geisler, maybe some of you know Daniel up at UC Davis, and he's going to do mineralization studies for us. So on this cover crop, I've been sampling it now every week for the last 3 or 4 weeks, and then I'm saving those samples and I'm going to give them to Daniel. And then what they've done with I don't know if you saw that really cool paper they did with Patricia Lazicki, and they had that nice regression curve looking at the C to N ratio of different organic fertilizers. And we're hoping to develop a curve like that, looking at the C to N ratio of these cover crops. How much do they mineralize over a given period of time, depending on their C to N ratios? And so the concept then is, let's say this grower, he knocks us down after 60 days. It has a C to N ratio of 16 to 1. How much of that nitrogen mineralizes by the time you get to the cropping season, February or so, and how much doesn't? So the amount that does not mineralize, that's your credit. That's our concept. And so we have to play that out and see where we go with it.
All right, but you've heard a lot right now, but any questions for Richard? I mean, thank you very much. This is utterly important. Cece, yeah.
We were talking about earlier today how there's a seed shortage, cover crop seed shortage. How does that impact farmers if they are mandated to plant cover crops?
Well, there's a shortage, you know, something like the rye's are terrible in terms of making seed. Like there was one variety that we hardly had any of it last year. But there's other varieties, like there was plenty of Pacheco triticale. We had lots of that. So, you know, you go to an alternative cover crop. I don't think that's a big issue.
Let me ask the skeptics question here. All right, so that we talked about earlier. All right, so this cover crop is taking up nitrogen and scavenging it, like Eric's video that they saw is about. All right, that nitrogen, though, then as you pointed out, is in the biomass here. It gets mixed in the soil like over there, and that nitrogen's still there.
Yeah.
And it's mineralizable and it's leachable at some point in the future. How does that constitute a credit? Because next year they're going to put on an additional 80 pounds of nitrogen that gives them the allowance. But how is that legitimately a credit?
Well, what
it's not leaching in the winter, I suppose.
Well, some of it is. What ends up happening with a cover crop when it starts to break down, this tissue right here, if you took the C to N ratio of this is going to be very low. That's going to mineralize in a hurry. And then this is where we want growers to try and leave these cover crops as long as they can, because this tissue, the stem tissue, is different. That's got a higher C to N ratio. So the nitrogen that's in here is probably not going to be leachable. And so that's my argument. This nitrogen right here should, because it's legitimately carrying that nitrogen over the winter into the next spring. Okay. And then once you get into the next spring, then that's when you do your soil testing and you do all these things to adjust your fertilizer.
All right, okay, no, all right. So you see that an important point there, that they adjust and apply maybe less because they know what they've got in the bank there, right there. Are
yeah.
Other questions here? Thank you, Richard.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you mentioned this, but so what is done to the cover crop after the growing season for it?
They'll mow it and then disc it and then prepare the ground, probably chisel it and get it into these winter beds.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you go over there right now, I mean, that was broccoli just a couple of weeks ago. You hardly see much residue because the leaf tissue is going to break down. It's very, very low C to N ratio. But there's other things. There's the stems. With any biological material, you have what we call a fast breakdown phase and then a slow breakdown phase. And depending on the C to N ratio, the percent that actually totally mineralizes, it never gets to 100. There's always some amount that starts acting like soil organic matter. You know, so you have a quick, you know, the labile, and then you have the slow steady. And depending on the C to N ratio, if the C to N ratio is high, then that amount that actually mineralizes is much, much less. Broccoli is different. It's like 3 or 3.5% nitrogen when you knock it down, the whole plant. So that stuff mineralizes pretty quickly, but never 100%.
All right. Sorry to cut you short here.
Yeah.
But we've got to get going. But we would like to thank you for all this fabulous crop cover knowledge that you're imparting on us, and as a token of our appreciation, we wanted to give you this shirt for PLS
thank you.
class.
Thank you, Celeste.
Couldn't have guessed, huh, Richard? No, but listen, we appreciate this. This was very in depth and thorough and clear explanation of the work that these folks are doing here, but the value of it too here. So we do have to hit the.
Yeah.
We're sorry for coming.